snapshot about Warangal. It is a beautiful city, no doubt. It is very close to our heart because we've been working with the city. It's the second largest city in Telangana. It's a historical city. It is a city of lakes, and water bodies are critical, and the well-being of the water bodies and environment is critical to the sustenance of the city. It is also a smart city. It comes under the smart city mission. It has a population of about 10 lakhs right now and more. As per the census, it is 0.8 million, but it's about 10 lakhs now. The 30% of the population is living in slums. That is a challenge. The city is completely non-sewered, and that's what makes it very interesting. The city has introduced FSM regulations in 2016 and consistently worked. As Najmaji pointed out, it took a very planned approach and consistently worked from 2016 onwards and has achieved ODF in 2017, has achieved ODF++ in 2019, and has brought several benefits to its citizens. With that background, I would like to sort of, it might look a little bit of a theoretical run for you, but it's important because we are looking at principles and understanding them. Having a common understanding is critical for us. So if we look at the principles and what is it that we really need to work on and how these are aligned with sustainable development goals. There are 7 principles that the CWIS approach entails. The first one is that everyone in urban areas, including the urban poor, or especially the urban poor, benefit from the equitable, safe sanitation services. So what does that mean? That means that if you have decided that we must construct individual household toilets, and you find that there are localities where land tenure is not clear, do we let that go? We don't. We find ways of ensuring that irrespective of the land tenure, we ensure that they have access to individual household toilets. How do we ensure that the public toilets which are constructed or the community toilets which are constructed are accessible to everyone in terms of affordability? How do we ensure that the poor are prioritized over and cross-subsidized by those who can afford more? How do we ensure that the waste which is coming from one area is not resting in the other and causing ill health to the others? So the whole idea is that we take a comprehensive approach, not zonal approach, but a citywide approach, and we prioritize urban poor. Some of the initiatives that you saw reflected, which will fall broadly under these principles. Of course, these principles, there are overlaps, and rightfully so. But the sanitation helpline that you mentioned about is falling directly under this principle because the helpline was established to ensure that individual household toilets are constructed, particularly for those under the poverty line. So not that people above the poverty line were discriminated against, but having the sanitation helpline helped the city in prioritizing those below the poverty line. So the city has not just established a helpline for construction of new toilets, it also used the helpline for receiving complaints, receiving, the subsidy flow from Swachh Bharat mission, which was given for construction of individual household toilet, was given in 2 tranches. So citizens may have received the first tranche and not received the second tranche. So there is a financial burden. So such kind of complaints about the public toilets not being clean, any technical assistance in terms of, I want to construct, I don't have a good mason, can you suggest a mason? So all these were looked at from the sanitation helpline. what is even more important to understand is the institutional structure that was put behind to ensure that the sanitation helpline serves its purpose. So the institution structure included setting up what is called a project implementation unit, a PIU, which was headed by the additional commissioner and comprised a team from town planning, sanitary inspectors, and a member in charge of slum sanitation. And all these team members would meet every Friday of the week to ensure that all the applications received that week are cleared, all the complaints received that week have been addressed. And this was done on a mission mode over a period of 3-4 months. Substantial improvement was brought in terms of streamlining. And this is how the poor were, needs of the poor were taken care of. As you've already seen, the requirement for toilets for women were addressed, and there are she toilets, the school toilets have been looked into. Sanitation products such as sanitary pad dispenser, incinerators are integral part of every public toilet. There are mobile toilets, and the results are there on the screen. So from individual household toilet coverage of 77, it went to 91 by 2021. Public toilets from 28 have gone to 142. I'm very happy to share with you that the public toilets in Warangal, perhaps the only city in the country which has public toilets on a very successful public-private partnership. So the model will be discussed with you much later, but just to give a brief, the land is given by the city, but the construction cost and the maintenance of that is taken up by a private operator. A user fee which is also fixed by the city, and robust service level agreements are drawn up in terms of opening time, cleanliness requirements, etc., complaint process, and it's a very successful model, and we'll be happy to share details about that with you. There were no community toilets. A need for community toilets has been expressed, and you can see she toilets, community toilets. All the fuel stations have been instructed and have agreed to open up their public toilets for public use. There are mobile toilets and e-toilets. So this question about how replicable is this model, I'd like to say that the S-line is replicable. Many cities now have learned and have started implementing. Fuel stations is a model which has gone up till the ministry, and many cities have used the Warangal model to scale up and implement this. She toilets have been scaled up across the country. So many of these initiatives, they are good initiatives, small initiatives, which have been replicated. The city also invested in desludging the slums because many times the population is not able to afford the frequent desludging that is required, and therefore end up practicing open defecation. So city at times on its own cost has taken up desludging services and put in their funding. They have also taken up slum improvement. As you see, a beautiful park has been placed, and the entire boundary wall of the park is used for sanitation communication, and that helps in promoting and sustaining the interventions which are taken up. The second principle is gender and social equity. And all of you have observed that initiative. What does this mean? It means not just building toilets or looking at women as beneficiaries, but involving women, vulnerable groups, those marginalized, into the sanitation planning process to get their voices, to understand what is their concern, whether it is a transgender community, whether it is fisher folks requirements, how do you get them into this process of decision making? One of the processes that the city did was establish City Sanitation Task Force, and it's an active City Sanitation Task Force, a multi-stakeholder group comprising representatives from transgender community, from differently abled community, from sanitation worker community, and schools and colleges, so that everybody's needs are taken into consideration in the planning process itself. Sanitation worker, in addition to getting their input in planning. Engaging women in livelihoods is another aspect. Engaging them in decision-making process is another activity which would fall under this principle. Workers' health and rights through training program, provision of PPE, these activities also fall under this principle. So here you can see, attempts have been made to integrate women in decision making, in mason training, livelihoods. Formal contracts have been issued by the city to women self-help groups for maintenance of toilets. And in Warangal, currently 80 public toilets are maintained by women self-help groups. And this model also has been scaled up to the rest of the state. And across the state, 220 public toilets are being maintained by women self-help groups. So there is, of course, there are glitches in terms of payments and all that, which get addressed by the state government, by the city government through continuous monitoring and continuous interaction. Principle 3 talks about human waste is safely managed. And as we have been discussing, and as we saw in the Japanese Japan's case study also, it's a combination of systems. So it's technology agnostic. And when we are looking at managing waste, it is not just the treatment plant, but it starts with the quality of the containment system itself. We discussed on-site treatment like Jacasso earlier. Mason training is an integral part of this principle. Introducing building regulations, which will include toilet as an integral part of giving building permission. So any new building which is coming up would include toilet as an integral part for getting permission. This system has been introduced in Telangana, and it is online system, it's monitored, and the city also does a periodic 100% survey of all new properties to check, the town planning department does it, to check whether all new buildings have safe containment systems or not. This is extremely important. The other component is also what do you do with the already constructed toilets which are not having safe containment? So what kind of conversion of insanitary toilets can be taken up? City has taken an initiative. All the households with insanitary toilet above the poverty line have been issued notices and a timeline, and all the ones below poverty line have been provided with subsidy and support. And almost 11,000 toilets have been converted from insanitary to sanitary, and this is in itself a role model for other cities to learn from. And in addition to that, there are so many other technology possibilities, whether it is introduction of shallow sewer in a particular slum, because there's no space to have individual septic tanks, or there is no funding to have underground sewerage. So can we have shallow sewer system? Can we have combined septic tanks? Can 4 or 5 houses decide to pool in funds and have a combined septic tank? Can we have a mini wastewater treatment at the end of that locality? Can we have nala diversion? So there's so many technology options which a city can and must think of, and all those thinking about these hardware investments and how to make them run would fall broadly under this principle. Of course, training of masons, desludging operators, and FSTPs are an integral part of this principle. A city has been doing it regularly, and also one of the few cities in the country to have women desludging operators. PPP, this is the beautiful fecal sludge treatment plant, which we would love you to visit. There are 2 plants in Barangay. We'll be discussing the technology component, and Professor Chari had already mentioned in his slides also. Attempts are being made to understand how the treated byproducts can be used gainfully. And the local universities are working, the faculty members as well as international teams have visited and testing the quality of the treated wastewater, which is definitely meeting all the standards. And in the absence of any standards for treated bio waste, The standards for compost are being used, and these are also being tested. A plot of land has been taken and tests are being conducted to see whether vegetables or fruits grow better when they have this, use this as a soil conditioner or not. This is a work in progress. Farmers are happy to receive these free of cost right now. How can one price it? How can one brand it? How do we meet the regulatory requirements is a work in progress. 150 KLD plant is also a work in progress. Some of you have mentioned this in your discussions, that a city of this size, would this plant be sufficient, these two plants be sufficient? A new proposed RFP has been released. A complete mapping of each and every household for the toilet containment that they have. Do they have a septic tank, twin pit? When was the last date of desludging? All this is captured on a, and it is geotagged, and these are available. And this will help in conducting what is called a scheduled desludging, that is dividing the city into zones and ensuring that all the households are desludged once in 3 years through the city providing those services. This is all planned, and all the city officials. There is a cell called the non-sewer sanitation cell, comprising 5 members of engineers, environmental engineers, behavior change and gender specialists, who report to and the municipal health officer, and they all report to the commissioner, and they meet on a regular basis to take the sanitation decisions and implementation and monitoring forward. This is an example of decentralized. On the one on the left, green one, is a decentralized wastewater treatment plant established through CSR funding in a low-income housing facility of 500 units. This costed us about 45 lakhs. And this would cater to almost 2,000 plus 2,000 to 2,500 members. And what is most important is that to showcase this, and after seeing this, the government has taken a decision that all the low-income housing projects in Telangana would henceforth include decentralized treatment plant as part of the RFP itself. The system that you see on the right side is a pilot of Chukaso that we have taken up in a residential school. This is done by Daiki. You can see the brand. I think Shibil would have shared some details of that as well. And the city, by virtue of having smart city funds and even otherwise, is establishing multiple decentralized wastewater treatment systems. One has been established in a hospital, and during the COVID time, that had really come to benefit the city, because that is the biggest hospital and the COVID care center. The principle 4 to 7 would be handled in much detail by Elise, and therefore I will just skim through them. Principle 4 talks about who is the authority, whose baby is sanitation, who is responsible for sanitation, because it falls under multiple departments, and since it is everybody's job, nobody takes responsibility. So, so who is responsible, who is monitoring it, who is looking at the performance indicators, meeting or not, who is assigning funds? So I think it's very important for the city to have that clarity. In order to bring the clarity, the non-sewer sanitation cell was formed as a pilot, as a test. That does it work when you have a multi-departmental group? Will it work? And since it had worked very well, the city is taking a step forward, and it has already put up a proposal which is cleared by the state government to set up a separate department for environment sanitation. So this department, comprising engineers, executive engineers, which is environmental engineers, MIS officers, communication experts, and gender and social development experts, will take care of planning, implementation, monitoring of all the sanitation related aspects, which includes training and human aspects, as well as communication aspects. So the recruitment process is being initiated. This also includes a special officer for slum improvement. These are some of the ICT systems. So Warangal has been instrumental in bringing several ICT systems to sanitation, which have been scaled up at national level. The first citizen feedback in public toilets, that smiley face punch machine was introduced, and that has been adopted by CWIS Sarvekshan. What we see here is another innovator who came with an ICT system to assess the quality of public toilets, whether they're clean, whether they smell well, whether there is water or not. It's an ICT-based system which was tested. This was expensive. Then there is also a system that the sanitary inspector monitors the public toilet in his or her region twice in a week mandatorily, and uploads it using a mobile app specifically created along with photographs. And this information goes and sits on a real-time basis on a state level dashboard. And sitting at the state level, one can see how many toilets are falling under good category, how many need improvement, which are these 50 which need improvement, who is maintaining this 50, which town is it coming from. And this is a great decision-making tool. And this was initially introduced as just a mobile app in Warangal and got scaled up to state level with this entire as a data monitoring system. Again, monitoring systems for movement of trucks. There are close to 14 trucks right now with scheduled desludging, which is regular desludging once in 3 years. The trucks will go to 75. All the trucks have to be fitted with GPS trackers so that you know that the desludging is actually being decanted at the location, which is the fecal/treatment plant and nowhere else. So monitoring that, also taking information from the households. This FSM tracker is for that purpose. So here you can see the map, the movement, and the Environmental Sanitation Department would be looking into it. The city is also very particular about building regulations. So no new toilet should have a poor containment. Right now, the 98% compliance has been found. This is also to your question. The fifth principle talks about what are the different types of financing models, private participation or private sector funding. Is there a revenue model, service contracts? The city has implemented a range of these contracting and financing models, in addition to, of course, thinking in terms of the hardware approaches. Many of these approaches are also, through engaging self-help groups, ensuring they get loans under the government schemes of NSK, FTC, rehabilitation of desludging operators who are working as workers on the desludging vehicle, getting them loans so that they can become entrepreneurs. All these are initiated by the city. And on the photograph, you see our ex-commissioner, and on the left side, you see the municipal health officer. The sixth principle talks about long-term planning. And how do you ensure that these innovations that you're taking up are sustained? A very important point that was brought out by you as well. So engaging citizens from the grassroots level, going to them is extremely important. Educating them is very important. Having mass communication campaigns consistently is important. And also important is that all these innovations which are implemented are sustained and taken over. The baton is passed on to the next commissioner and the other members, and not that it just stops with the person. So all these innovations in Warangal are tabulated and extensively shared. And now the city has been recognized as a city of innovations by the state as well as the national government. And it is proceeding to start what is called a wash hub. This wash hub, which will have innovations in water sanitation and hygiene, will be housed in ASCII. It is a partnership initiative of State Government of Telangana and ASCII. This will promote innovations. It will promote networking and partnerships between city governments, innovators, funders, academic institutions, consultants. This is already, MOU is already signed, and it's the process of launching is on the way. And this is my last slide, where we are talking in terms of political will. In my first session, the small video clip that we had shown you about, does this happen in your town or not? And many of you had accepted, saying, unfortunately, it does, where you see the sludge being decanted into a drinking water canal. So it is a small video like that, which can really move people. And political will needs to be worked on at multiple levels, right from the chief minister to down to the local board in charge. And it's important to get everybody on board, so that no change in leadership at any level would lead to change of the focus of the city on improving sanitation. Alongside tariff structures and what kind of reforms are required, this is a thinking which needs to go alongside to ensure that the initiatives are sustained. Many people have visited the city, and one of the biggest requirements for you to be a CWIS city is to share your failures, share your success, share your innovations, so that everybody joins this journey. So therefore, this course that we have is also part of our commitment to CWIS, that we are sharing our learnings with all of you, so that we become a larger cohort. This is a slightly dated, but yes, Warangal is on the way of becoming a CWIS city, and it's making all attempts. And one of the numbers that we're very proud of is the amount of sewage we have prevented from entering into the beautiful lakes city. We have also noted all the recommendations that you have made today, and we will take them on your behalf to the city government and see how we can integrate them into the existing work streams. So thank you. I could not look at the chat room, and I will not look at the chat room also in the interest of time, because I've, I think, taken more than what I would. And I hope Professor Chari was actively responding to all your queries. So I'm going to take a breather. Let's take a 5 minutes, 10 minutes, if Elise is okay, about a 5 minutes breather. If there are any burning questions or points that you feel we should discuss before inviting Ms. Elise to take the session forward. Any questions, any thoughts, any observations? Otherwise, I would be happy to look at the chat box and respond. And with your permission, I would like to invite Ms. Elise. Hi, Elise. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I hope it's not a very inconvenient time for you. And
perfect. Thank you all. It's a great presentation. I'm super happy to be following that. A little intimidated. That was so comprehensive, and I love hearing all of the details of the Warangal case. But it's really nice to be reminded how far you all have come and how much creativity has been invested in constant problem solving and innovation, creative innovation in Warangal. It's been really nice. Do you want me to share my screen and the
yeah,
presentation?
thank you, Elise. Yeah.
Are you seeing the screen? Oops.
Not, yeah, it's loading. We can see it now.
Great. And do you see it on the full slide?
Yes.
Good. So I have several slides here. I'm going to go through some of them very quickly and just read the headlines and then focus in on a few more. So the materials are there for you to look at in more detail, but the commentary will really focus in on just 4 or 5 slides given time. And I think based on the conversations that I've been hearing and the material that Dr. Malini already covered, I think focusing in on a few examples might be the most helpful. I want to start by just saying how impressed I have been just joining this morning's session at the level of detail in the questions that are being asked. It's clear that everyone who's speaking up here has already been giving this a lot of thought, and these are not shy questions or superficial questions. These reflect a lot of commitment to ongoing services. So I'm super excited about this conversation and the session overall. I want to maybe just frame a little bit about the foundation's role here. I think one of the things that we agreed to with Bill and Melinda when we started the team was that this was not going to be a charitable intervention in the water and sanitation space. Bill and Melinda both said there's a problem in the sector and it's going to get bigger given the rate of urbanization and climate change. How do we improve the sector overall? And so we're obligated to be thinking constantly with our partners and grantees about how do we stepwise change the way this urban sanitation sector works so that it's better suited to serve humans in the context of urbanization and climate change. How do we protect health better? How do we protect scarce resources better? And so the orientation of this presentation is really about sector change. And it's a lot of the details of what you've been discussing already, but I'm going to step back a little bit and look at the sector level and then drill back down into some of the specifics in a couple cases. So we have a new acronym. You had FSM, you had CLTS, we throw around these acronyms. So I want to cover why are we giving the sector a new acronym? What does it mean, and what are some cities learning and achieving? And again, I will go quickly, so apologies if I'm going too fast. Malini, I can see you, so just raise your hand if I need to slow down. I talk fast anyway, and sometimes in the interest of time, I talk way too fast. So starting out, we changed the goal. We had this global goal to provide everyone with access to a toilet. And then with the SDGs, we changed the goal to not just say access, but equitable access and access to services, not just infrastructure, but the actual safely managed services that people require on a daily basis, not once, but on a continual basis. So I want to flag that that's an important change. But our sector kept this hardware focus. And so we had traditional kind of sewer focus. We've talked a lot about NSS and FSM, which is really a different kind of hardware, but the hardware orientation remained. What Malini just covered are the principles of a new approach that looks at services and really puts the people first, and then looks at what kind of system do we need to serve people on an ongoing basis, what incentives need to be there, what services need to be in place. So not what do you need to build today or tomorrow or in your next 5-year plan, but how do we continue starting today with what infrastructure you have? Maybe you have a bunch of septic tanks or toilets that aren't safe containment. If you don't have a $4 million upgrading program, how do you start to deliver services with what you have now? And that's really the orientation that we're going to look at this from, because every city is starting from a different place. Every country is starting from a different place. What we do know is that hardware approach was insufficient, not only because we need service systems, but because we know that hardware spending doesn't result in services. Service systems result in services, and they require hardware spending, but if you just put the hardware spending, you don't get good results. And this is these 3 studies here are just a small number of the many reports that are out there that look at how pervasive hardware failures are. It doesn't mean that you should not invest in hardware. It means that you have to invest in the enabling environment. An enabling environment is one of those terms like sustainability that is squishy and people like to ignore because it means everything and it can be overwhelming. And so what the next slides are kind of an approach to try to make that less squishy and harder to ignore, because we don't want to keep repeating some of the statistics on this slide. I want to call out specifically the last report on this page, the 4S program. That is linked if you have the deck. If not, you can look up 4S and Borda Evag. There are several documents there that look at policy recommendations and really look at some specific institutions associated with the India context. So that's a good resource for another time. So what do we know? We know that what gets measured gets managed. That's a saying that lots of people use in public policy. Maybe it doesn't automatically get managed if it gets measured, but we know for sure that if it's not being measured, it's not going to be managed. And in sanitation, there's very little that gets measured. And so the examples that Melanie gave and that you heard from Kampala earlier, establishing measurement systems, not baseline project baselines, but real measurement systems that allow services to be managed is super important at the local level and at the national level. We know that if you don't target the poor, they're going to be put last, and the last never comes because you never get done with the needs of the most vocal, wealthier components of your city. So if you don't put clear targets around reaching the poor, they're not going to be reached. And that's at the global level for investment banks, national investment levels, and local investment levels, again, for both infrastructure and services. If you don't have very explicit targets for the poor, they will be put last, and that generally means that's kind of always next. Another thing that we do know for sure about sanitation markets is that they fail. So market failure is an economic kind of lingo term, but it basically means that all of the private sector can be formalized, individuals can have a lot of cash and be interested in sanitation, and the market will still fail to protect the public goods that you need to protect public health, the environment, and long-term sustainability of natural resources. That market failure is common to lots of problems, air pollution, water pollution, and sanitation is indicative of that. But we know that they can also be corrected with interventions. If you don't have those interventions, the interests of the private individuals and the private sector, as developed as they are and as much money as they may have, they will always be misaligned with those public goods, and you will always have pollution at the end of the pipe. And so you need to have public systems that bring the incentives together. It doesn't necessarily mean that the public sector needs to do all of the work. It doesn't mean that the government needs to control everything. It just means that there are market structures or policies and programs and incentive structures that need to be put in place to bring those two interests together so that what you're working on results in public good. What you're investing in for yourself results in a public good. And that's something that you see with the building codes, with lots of things where there are public policies and implementation programs. But for some reason, sanitation has been considered outside of that realm for a really long time. Sewers were considered public services. Anything outside of sewers were considered private matters. And that need to shift the entire sector's perspective that all sanitation services need to be considered a public service has been not an easy shift. I think especially because groups come from a lot of investment banks, policymakers, they come from rural sanitation. There was so much time and energy put into rural sanitation and so much emphasis in rural sanitation on private households taking responsibility for sanitation. That was kind of picked up and put into the urban sector, and it just doesn't work. The emphasis on utilities being responsible only for sewers really comes from a European and a US history, and it's not relevant where you already have built environments and a range of different investment patterns. So we want to start by saying, okay, we see this map a lot, and we need to challenge it. These assumptions about what the private sector should be doing or what the public sector should be doing, we need to question all of that. What the role of local government is, we need to step back from some of these assumptions as fact and think through how do we get to our goal. And so we start, if you want to go all the way back, we say, you know, what service outcomes do you want and how do you get there? And there are some questions that I put here that are simple, and then I'm going to go into them in a little bit more detail. But these are the questions that every city and every country can start to use to interrogate their own system and their own and governance structure, because all of the detailed questions that I'm hearing around, you know, how do you structure your PPPs for waste management or public toilet management? How do you make sure that public toilets are reaching poor communities? Those are really detailed questions that you want somebody in every single town to be asking. There's not an answer to that question, to any of those questions, that's going to be universal for everyone. What you need in a public service setting is for somebody in every single town to be deeply motivated, incentivized, and resourced to be asking that question. And if no one is responsible for ensuring services are delivered, and they're not accountable to somebody else, and they're not resourced to answer those questions, then the questions will only be asked as long as there's a project there and somebody's watching. And then they go away. And then you only have services for short periods of time in project cities. And we don't want project cities and projects, we want services and public service systems. And so asking these questions from the very beginning is the place to start. So, you know, the next level is from the SDGs or from your own policy frameworks. Generally, equity, safely managed services and sustained services are what we want to see, right? And the details of that you can get into. Malini went into fantastic detail. I'm sure you've heard a lot about some of these before. There are detailed indicators, KPIs for these. But if you agree on those are the three things that you want to see in your city: equitable services, safe services, and sustained services. How do you get there? Given the context of market failure, given the nature of sanitation, how do you get there? You have to have somebody who's responsible. They have to be accountable to someone, another entity, and there has to be resource planning and management. They have to be resourced to solve the problem. And what we found, I think that we were, I would say, not I think, we were very naive when we started this program, and we set really high expectations for ourselves and for our partners. I'm going to skip over the outcomes actually. But when we thought about how you could create change and demonstrate good systems, we were really focused at the city level. And what we found, and I think this came up a lot in the chat in the last session, was that cities' hands are often tied by state and national level constraints. And so you have to have a clear mandate that's set at a national level for who's responsible at the local level. That can't be a city deciding to take on sanitation as a public service. They have to be mandated to do that, or they can't resource themselves. And furthermore, they can't, a lot of times they don't have the permission to establish departments, to use financing. I don't know if somebody doesn't like that resource planning and management section. I don't know if you can see someone marking that up. If that's a problem, you just put it in the chat and tell me what you don't like about that part. But that national and local level coordination is super important. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about the Warrengall City investment that we've made, is that ASCII has really done a lot to toggle back and forth between what is needed at the city level and what's going to allow them to back out as a project provider and project coordinator and ensure that those services are sustained after the project is over, and that the example in Warrengall is replicated by other cities, that there's an incentive and systems set up to allow other cities to replicate without their own projects. without their own demonstration projects, that it really is a demonstration for others to follow and not a one-off case that's temporarily there. So I won't go into some of the details of of our program, but we have 8 cities across 5 countries where we're demonstrating this. We have the city demonstrations, and then we're now working increasingly, as I mentioned, with state and national institutionalization of some of this enabling environment to really clarify mandates, define accountability systems for what those local authorities need to be providing, and matching resources with mandates. I want to detail now the case of Zambia, and Lusaka was our city that we worked in, but the example here that I'm sharing is really at the country level. So digging in a little bit to the 3 functions and how their enabling environment has evolved, I want to start with the responsibility component. In 2012, I believe, it might have been 2011, I couldn't find the exact date, we funded an NGO to put up some fecal sludge treatment plants. They were working with local community organizations called water trusts. The utility was mandated to deliver sewer sanitation, but they did not have a clear mandate to deliver non-sewer sanitation. Their license was about sewage. So they were legally restricted from spending money, ratepayer money, on anything that was non-sewered. So the NGO, NGOs can be convincing, and they engaged the utility to do a little work, they engaged the city to do a little work, but nobody had a clear mandate. They established the FSTPs. They were really fantastic for a little while, and predictably, for different reasons, they are no longer working. In the meanwhile, that was probably I think it was like a $400,000 project for 3 years. In the meantime, the utility received $250 million for sewered sanitation coverage. They have about 15% of their city covered now. Their goal was to cover 20% more, so they wanted to cover 35% of their city for $250 million. Tagged onto that was another $20 million-ish for non-sewer sanitation. So for the rest of the 85% of the city that didn't have any sewer network, they had about 10% of that budget for to treat 85% of this, to deal with 85% of the city. And part of that was basically like chump change, basically, because it wasn't the utility's mandate to deliver services to them. And it was a problem. They're all on an aquifer. Everyone drinks from the aquifer. All of the pits are open at the bottom. There was a cholera outbreak, and so there was some money added into the sewer project to deal with this cholera outbreak. In 2019, the utility's license was changed, and so all of a sudden they were not just responsible for sewers and the 15, hopefully 35% of their city that would be sewered, but they were responsible for ensuring everybody in that city had safe sanitation services. That was a major game changer. It was a policy change that was captured by the regulator, and the regulator changed Lusaka's license to operate. When that license changed, they were suddenly required to manage the waste of 85% more people in the city, 85% of the city, and they have a mandate to cover Lusaka, but also I think three or four surrounding cities. So the metro area is almost 3 million people. That's a lot of people. Lusaka had never dealt with the non-sewered sanitation technologies before, apart from a little bit of work on these FSTPs, and they did not know heads or tails of how to approach this. A lot of the people on the board were really deeply opposed to expanding that mandate and were very set on not doing the work apart from the license, just ignoring the mandate entirely. And the path from that point over the last 2 to 3 years has really been amazing, because they did eventually establish a department. They were not going to establish a department. They have a clear FSM department. They had a sewer sanitation department. What's interesting, and this goes back to what Malini was saying about having a I think a slum improvement officer. The FSM department is actually hosted under the Low Income Communities Engagement Program. And so they work closely with the sewerage department in coordinating infrastructure, but they really took a service approach to this, and are working with the focus being first and foremost on reaching those low income communities. So at the national level, they changed the policy. At the national level, they changed the licensing agreement. And Lusaka responded by establishing a clear department. They staffed that department. It took a long time to get those positions approved, especially because the board wasn't interested. It took a lot of effort to demonstrate that it could be financially viable, and how it could be financially viable. They had to work very closely with an economic regulator. So around the accountability mechanism, the regulator NOASCO set clear KPIs to say, these are the things that you're responsible for. Here's your policy, here's your license, here are the things that you're responsible for, and you can find their KPIs on their website. It's linked at the end of this deck. And here are not just the categories of work that you're responsible for, but here are the targets year on year that you're going to have to improve by. And if you improve, you'll continue to get permission for this environmental service fee. And so they allowed the utility to add an environmental service fee to the water bill, which created a permanent revenue stream to start providing services. That revenue stream is specifically earmarked for helping the poorest get services. And so it's, and then there's still user fees as well. So there's a user fee revenue component, and there's this, that for each household that gets emptied, and there's a component that's this cross subsidy that goes on everybody's water bill that helps support the poorest. And it's really focused on upgrading containment so that you can provide emptying services. If you have too informal of pits, you can't empty them. And so they needed to invest in hardware to both protect groundwater and to really establish a formal, clean, safe, mechanized emptying service. They ring-fenced that revenue because they lost the opportunity to charge that environmental service fee in the past because it was misused. And they lost the right to keep collecting that fee. And so it took them a lot to get it back. It's ring-fenced. It's directed directly to the FSM department. The FSM department now, after I think 2 years of paperwork or doing everything by paper, now has an automated cost and revenue, software that's increasingly integrated with the rest of the utility. So it's still ring-fenced revenue and expenditure, but the utility can manage their finances at a high level. Emptiers are paid based on how much they're doing, how well they're meeting their own contract targets. And so you can see the KPIs from the national level trickle down to implementation at the local level. And that's super interesting because it's really driven formalization of the sector where everything was done ad hoc on paper. Somebody mentioned, workers didn't have gloves and boots on in some of the pictures. That formalization process, you can't expect it to happen all at once. Every city is starting at different points. And it's the process of formalization. It's the process of setting up incentives, like I said, to get everybody, to get every city to have those people who are asking the same questions that you're asking. How do you do this better? How do we improve from where we are right now to where we need to be? What's the next step that we can do to improve? And that structure of those structures that are required to keep somebody in every city asking that question and trying to answer it, and feeling a little pressure from either the mayor or the municipal administrator or the regulator or whoever it is, whoever the accountability mechanism is, from the administrative levels and from the bottom up. How do you make sure that all of the behavior change information is not just about what individuals need to do, but what they should be expecting from their city? That's what builds accountability from the bottom up and what sets citizens' expectations that sanitation is a public service and that their government is responsible for an enabling environment that allows them to procure and benefit from safe services. Without that citizen expectation that this is a public service, you there's not enough chasing that you can do from the administrative level to really change systems. And so there's a top-down administrative accountability system that needs to be in place and a bottom-up citizen accountability system that needs to be in place. And that's about data, having data transparency, and a lot of behavior change communication that I think Warren Gall has really shared well, and that Lusaka really invested in as well. And then on the last point on resource planning and management, we've got to get rid of, I think India's way ahead of this, but the norm that households are the only ones who need to be investing in on-site sanitation, and that it's their responsibility to finance everything. It's not only regressive to the lowest income communities and households, but it's just not going to get us safe services. And you can't efficiently service containment if it's done in an ad hoc, low resourced, uncoordinated way. And households don't have the information to know how to upgrade their systems. They don't have the information, often they don't have the finances to upgrade in a way that enables an entire public service system. And so really making sure that the containment work is done and resourced in a way that allows for efficient service delivery is super important. And that's, I think, from a finance perspective, again, at the national level, there has to be permission to make those kind of on-site investments. There has to be a national level investment in human capacity and training, and workshops like the one we're in right now. And there has to be an emphasis on really tying finance to public service goals, and not just the most politically connected city. And that, again, requires data and data-driven decision-making. And if the data don't exist, you don't get data-driven decision-making. If the transparency around those data don't exist, then it's really hard to get ahead of political allocations. And so transparency, data, and clear policies are really important to accompany this capacity building component. And so that's a lot of what's happening in Zambia. What's interesting about Zambia is that they started with Lusaka because they had a lot of money from these projects. Even the Seward money, that money, frankly, like, there's not a clear path to paying back that loan. When we help them look at the financial numbers, it's not obvious how they're going to pay that back without, frankly, a politically unviable rate hike in their sewer tariffs. It's a loan that was made most likely with the anticipation that it was going to be written off or defaulted on by the utility. And I think, they can, I'm not speaking out of turn, but I think they've shared this in enough meetings that they didn't do that work to look at those financial numbers well enough in advance, because they didn't have the financial management systems in place to look at them. And it's unfortunate that some of the loans were made in a way that didn't require that. But I think they're working really hard, and it's really been impressive that, like, once they've seen those numbers, they're now working to improve the financial viability of even that Seward project. But they're also looking at, now, how do you invest more equitably if they're going to write off that loan, or pay down components of it? How do they invest equally and subsidize equally the non-Seward components of the city? And that conversation about how do we equitably invest in our city is a really important conversation to have at the local level, but also at the national level. If you're going to take a loan for $250 million for your capital city's sewer system, what does that mean for what you should be doing for non-networked communities in terms of finance? And looking at those, not from a philosophical perspective. I think we all say, we all can agree that we should be helping the poor and that we should invest in the poor, but look at it from a financial perspective. Look at the numbers. We don't have software and management systems that give you those numbers, then the likelihood of the infrastructure being managed in the long run in a financially viable way is really low. So if you haven't asked the question in advance and you can't answer that question of who's going to be served and how are we going to pay this back, or how are we going to pay our operating costs, it means that you're missing some software components, you're missing some service delivery and management components in your service system, and you're looking at a project. And we know that projects don't get don't result in services unless they're tied to a service delivery system. And that's some of the things that again, Lusaka is going through, but the regulator is taking up from the Lusaka case and translating into new requirements for the other utilities in the, thank you, Malini, in Zambia. And so the other utilities are now facing a lot of these same licensing changes and data requirements, data system upgrading requirements. Lusaka is going to be a utility that helps some of the other utilities advance faster than and skip some of the learning curve, but the regulator is also going to be providing that capacity building role. So I don't have my clock over here. Looks like I'm way out of time, so I'm going to skip Kulna as a case and just share again. This is in your materials, but really focusing on CWIS as a public service approach. We have to get to focus on the services, not the infrastructure, and we have to look at who's responsible and for ensuring services and how are they resourced to get there. So I'll leave it there with one of two of my bosses and take any questions.
At least there were some questions, and I thought I would start with those, and then maybe others could also join in. So may I request Mr. Mohammed Hussain to please ask your question. His question was around prioritizing the poor. Mr. Hussain, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. During the presentation, it was actually about prioritizing the poor sector, because as Ms. Alison was saying that who are not measured, the things are not measured, are not managed, or who are not counted in the beginning, they will be left most of the time. So my query was, in a developing country where the resources are very limited, and I'm going to start only for a small area, so then how do I prioritize the demography? I mean, do I first go for the poor, or do I make it strategic planning, like where it is easier or not? Because poor comes first according to the sort of presentation, but I mean, this is
I think every city is going to be a little different depending on what resources and what political will you have. I think what the target that we put into our framework with the CWIS cities is that one, you have to measure and know who's out there. And then you have to have a conversation about how you set targets. And that conversation is a political conversation, but it has to be participatory. So when you set clear city targets, what does that conversation look like? So making sure that the poor are visible and counted in that conversation when you set priorities is the most important thing. Making sure that there's an answer to know how much are we spending on non-poor communities per household? How much are we spending on poor communities? How much are poor communities paying for services? How much are rich communities paying for services? A lot of times, poor communities benefit the least from public services, and they're paying a lot more for bad services. So knowing those numbers will help you work with political partners and civil society and your state government to really clarify what your priorities are and come to common agreement on what those priorities should be. Our KPI for our projects is that levels of services in low-income communities should be improving at least as fast as those in higher income communities. So you should never be working for the poor last, right? You might not be only working for the poor, and you might not get all of the poor communities done first and then move on to wealthy communities, but there needs to be equitability in use of public finance, in costs to households, and in progress being made. And so if you have good measurement and you can see who's being served and who's not being served, how much they're paying and how much they're benefiting from public finance, are they improving at the same rate, at least as the rest of the community? And that again is the details of what that means in terms of your own city level KPIs or your state KPIs and targets for service improvements really is a conversation that you have to have at the local level. And it's better to have that with, again, with data and with as much transparency as possible. And that's what will help you answer that question and help every city kind of answer that question in a way that results in a feasible answer.
Thanks, Elise. We had two questions from Mr. Chanchal. Mr. Chanchal, are you there? One was regarding SWM, and the other question was, or more observation actually, about Uganda having sewage tariff built into the water tariff. Chanchal, would you please like to frame your question?
I don't see him in the participants, ma'am.
Okay.
I think.
So,
just for the benefit, Dr. Malini, so his question may be applicable for others also. So this is the best person too. So when we are looking at citywide sanitation, there are a lot of interface points between solid waste management now because of COVID. Even the household waste has become a little more biomedical type waste. So when we look at CWIS from our global perspective, are they looking at these interfaces? Was a question which Mr. Chanchal was asking, and a couple of other participants were also. Yeah.
Great. That's a fantastic question. I think the details of the answer depend on, in some ways, on what's your institutional arrangement. Sometimes if the city is responsible for both solid waste and liquid waste, it's easier to coordinate. If the liquid waste is managed by a wastewater utility or separate department, it's harder to coordinate with the solid waste department. That being said, especially where you have open pits, if you don't have solid waste disposal systems in place, you end up with a lot of garbage in your pits or latrines, and so then that undermines your ability to empty and service that on-site containment. And so that's one part of the answer, is that utilities that are serious about efficient emptying have to coordinate with whoever's responsible for solid waste service provision. And in Zambia, it looks like it might be a separate utility that emerges, but those conversations are started. And in some communities, the water utility is actually supporting solid waste management in some communities because it's so much more efficient to empty pits that don't have trash. And if there's not another solid waste program, then your pits become your garbage. But there are different ways to deal with, fees and things that help with and some limited technology upgrades that you can put to keep some of the trash out of the pits. If you don't have tight coordination yet, or if it's invariably a slow process. So you kind of need lots of different tools to deal with that integration. The other component that comes up is making sure that the solid waste and liquid waste people are working in a coordinated way around drains, because even as you get to upgrading, there's still a lot of gray water and often a lot of black water effluent that goes into open drains. If open drains are trash clogged, then that black water gets back into communities, and you can be emptying pits, but you're still seeing a lot of flooding, and then you don't have the health and environmental benefits that you would gain from emptying pits. And so that coordination has to happen. How it happens depends on the institutional arrangements of the different departments. But again, I think it goes back to saying who's incentivized to solve the problem in each town. And if there's a department that is driven by clear KPIs and targets, then they're incentivized to go solve a problem and find out where's the gap in the trash management, and how do we fix that so that we can achieve our own KPIs. On the tariff, sorry, really quickly on the tariff.
Yeah, the tariff was, the question he asked was, like in Africa and India, the sewage tariff, which is considered to be a public service, is integrated in the water. So in the water tariff, typically.
Yeah, what happens sometimes is that there's a sewer tariff that's added on to everyone's water bill. And that money goes to support sewers for 5 or 10% of the city. And you have poor people paying the sewer tariff for rich people's sewers. That's not cool. And so what Lusaka has done, and I think this is actually the same for Kampala, is that there's a sewer tariff only on those household bills that are receiving sewered services. What Lusaka did was put an environmental service fee on top of that. So that environmental service fee is on everybody's water bill, but the money is collected and ring fenced and only benefits the poorest communities. And it goes to upgrading containment and providing improved equipment for the private sector emptiers that are delegated to serving those areas, so that they can have charge affordable tariffs, but also be subsidized so that they can financially have a financially viable business. So the sewer just goes to sewer fees just go to sewers, which is why the financial viability of that loan starts to look a little shaky.
Malini, over to you.
Yeah, so one more question is Mr. Pankaj there. He wanted to understand replicability of CWIS in small towns, in the light of private sector and viability. Mr. Pankaj, are you?
Yeah, thank you for a very nice presentation and a detailed deliberations on the different pillars of citywide sanitation. My question here is that there is definitely a point to ponder, basically, because whatever we have seen till now is cities beyond maybe 500,000 kind of population. But if we really talk about a smaller level ULBs of, let's say, less than 100,000 or 50,000, then there are challenges related to the minimum level of market for the private sector, definitely. And first and foremost is people understanding that sanitation is an issue, because they might not be seeing sanitation as an issue, plus low level of affordability among the households, and also adherence to the standards and technological challenges. So how to overcome this? So this is my first question. The second is, can we have some kind of reference ballpark figure for per capita investment which government would require to put in place? Of course, different cities may be at different level of existing sanitation, but if somebody has to start from scratch, so how much money would be required from a kind of end-to-end solution per capita basis in standard systems, so that it would be really very helpful for us in terms of advocating with the government that in next 5 years you will require this much of money if we really want to look for the entire solution on citywide sanitation. Thank you. These are the two questions.
Those are fantastic questions. So for small towns, I think the answer is really goes back to that importance of, we expected we would demonstrate the CWIS idea, or our partners, we would tell our partners to demonstrate what good looks like. They would go figure that out in a couple of years, and then all of the other towns would follow. That's like the textbook definition of naivety. Our partners have been working so hard with so many resources, and you're right, and they are mostly in bigger cities. I think ASCII has been working in Narsapur, which is a small town. We have a couple examples of Y and Sinar, where they're also smaller towns. Again, a lot of it comes back to organizing the market and formalizing both fees and services, so that there are data and responsibilities allocated. In Y, they set up scheduled desludging, and they attracted a private sector emptier by collecting revenues from property taxes. In that state, there's a higher level collection rate of property taxes, so that was a solution that worked for them. Has it been replicated? I think they're still working on looking at replication. I think given the number of small towns that are out there and the number of challenges small town administrations have to deal with, they have to deal with all of the same number of challenges and issues that a large city has to deal with, but it's usually the same 5 people who are dealing with all of them. Morgues, spoiled milk, roads, drains, it's a small town administration size. So for small towns, it becomes much more important that at the district and state level, there is an enabling environment that helps aggregate markets in some cases, establish clustered public service districts, support small towns with templates for how to engage the private sector in contracts, so that you don't have to come up with your own contract every time. I think that those kind of aggregating market size around clusters of small towns is really important, developing tools and really driving support for small towns from that state level. So the state is not just holding small towns accountable, but really taking responsibility for building capacity and supporting appropriate economies of scale, and frankly investing in some of those upgrades and asset costs that small towns are just never going to be able to tackle. And they do that for markets, public markets, they do that for other public assets, and so there's no reason that can't be done for sanitation as well. I think to your second question of, you know, how do you tell your administrator how much it's going to cost to upgrade? We've been working with a tool called the CWIS SAP that looks at exactly that. How much would it cost in different scenarios if you want to upgrade 100% of your city containment, or if you want to upgrade 50% of your city containment services, get some trucks, deliver services. What are the costs and revenue implications for different kinds of upgrading scenarios and service delivery scenarios, ranging from full sewer coverage to zero service coverage and just FSM coverage. And that scenario mapper, right now it's kind of complex. It's a little bit unwieldy. It's not a quick and dirty tool, but part of that is because costs vary so much from place to place. But there are several costing tools out there right now. The SAP tool, I see the question to share it. I think I'll find the address and drop it in the chat box. But those costing tools, I think, are going to be high level unless you have a more localized initiative that looks at some of the local costs available or that are in your marketplace. So I think you kind of can compare scenario costs and rank order them, but getting to the specifics really requires some legwork on within each market. But there are lists of costs. The World Bank also has a tool for costing sanitation, and I think Leeds University in the UK also has a costing tool for sanitation that's supposed to look at sewer and non-sewer sanitation. So let me pull some of those together and drop them in the chat, or share them with Malini and she can share them out. I think maybe one other comment is in that CWIS SAP website, there the CWIS Cities website it's at the bottom of the deck. That has, I think that also has several resources from each of the cities where we're investing, case studies, examples of contracts, and I think there are some costing examples in there as well. So if you tool around on some of those cities, you'll find the costing examples from different cities.
Prisachari, any question from your side? And then I'll also request you to conclude the session after that.
Yeah, just on the costing side, just like to add to what Mr. Pankaj said, Tamil Nadu also has done what is called the State Investment Program. So we will share with you some data. You know, they looked at the total state investment required for sanitation improvement, of course, as a combination of both sewer systems in certain big cities and non-sewer systems. And we could also put together probably, we don't have a complete costing, but bits and pieces of the costing in some of our CV cities. So we could also share with you to get a sense of the investments required for making the transition. So thank you very much, Alice, for giving a comprehensive picture, and also a sort of a well-rounded appreciation of this whole concept of citywide inclusive sanitation. It's not just infrastructure, but it is a public service as one of the key things. So this concept of public service has been sort of repeatedly told by us. This is the third session. From session 1, from the inaugural session to now, and today you clarified sewerage is considered as a public service, but sanitation is not in a true sense. So do you have any quick formula? How do we communicate this idea that sanitation is a public service, not just sewerage? Is there any quick way of communicating this to the policymakers and practitioners from any national, international experiences? Easy way to communicate.
Yeah, I would only say that, you know, a lot of people say, well, a lot of people have compared sanitation to cell phones, and they say, oh, everybody has a cell phone, but they don't have a toilet. Or everybody has electricity and they don't have a toilet. Why is that? And I think it's really important to, or if we can do it for cell phones, then we should be able to do it for toilets. And I think it's really important to convey, maybe this is too, I think this is just really important. If you have a cell phone, that's what you want, right? You want the cell phone, you want a glass of water, you want to turn on your lights. In the sanitation sector, what you want is to have your privacy, which you can deal with mostly yourself, and then you want the waste to be out of your space, right? That's the consumer good. The public good component of that happens after. And so you can take care of your consumer need, and the rest of it never has to happen. Nobody pickets when a sewer treatment plant doesn't work, right? You don't see picket lines. You don't see phone calls. You don't see the economy crashing. You don't see it. There's an economic drain, but you don't see it. If the power station shuts down and your lights don't go on, that doesn't last very long, right? Like, people get really mad if their power isn't on, if their internet isn't working, if the cell tower is down and your phone isn't working. That public good component, or that big CapEx, the coordination of those things that you don't see, if they aren't working, your phone isn't working, and that means trouble. That built-in accountability does not work in sanitation, because the public good component happens after the consumer good. You go to the bathroom, you pay whoever to get it out of your space, and then it's somebody else's problem. It's the same with solid waste, but at least solid waste is visible. That means that we can't spend time kind of messing around with saying, well, should the public deal with sewers and non-sewers? That reality of consumer good happens and then the rest of the stuff happens is inherent to the sanitation, It's just the way we work, right? And unless someone comes up with some amazing market way to change what humans care about, we have to consider it a public good. We have to invest in coordinating around that public good component, or that waste is going to be in the drain. That's all there is. Like, there's not another way to solve the human condition, like to address the human condition. I think, Dr. Sherry, we've talked about this before. Like, humans care about ourselves. Like, we care about ourselves. We care about the community to an extent, but we can't solve these public good problems without a government solution, which is why we have governments. And there is not another utility scenario that is as hard to deal with as human waste, because it's invisible and because the consumer component happens before the rest of it. So we can talk about sewers or non-sewers or magic toilets or whatever we want to talk about in terms of technologies. We still need government to help coordinate and make sure that our water stays clean.
Thank you so much. So programs like this, having state and city leaders to understand this and also communicate to your own policymakers, your politicians, your administrators, taking this message itself is a part of this whole narrative. And that's exactly why we have someone like Alice to clarify some of these doubts. And I hope all of you will carry this single message that sanitation is a public service. We can bring private sector for efficiency reasons, for investment reasons, but eventually the accountability of and waste management rests squarely with the local governments as per our constitution. So I think with this very powerful message, I would like to thank Alice. Unless Dr. Sitaram would like to have any final word. Otherwise, I thank Alice for this wonderful session. And she's going to share some of the tools and data which we will communicate to all of you. And thank you very much, Alice, for taking out your time. It's a little off from your routine, but in terms of timing, but greatly appreciate supporting us at every level. Thank you all. Friends, we will see you on Saturday again and we would have some more exciting conversations and exciting case studies and videos. Thank you very much.
Just one point, we will be sharing a link on the WhatsApp group wherein you can put all your questions, and we are placing all the FAQs also in the same link. So sometimes what happens is, suppose Sanjay ji puts in a question and Mr. Mithilesh was also thinking of the same, there is a opportunity for you to just click on the like button. That way we get to understand how many of you are looking at the same issue, and we can find some ways of integrating those questions into the session. So we'll be sharing that link with you today, and please feel free to use that. So thank you very much once again, and Elise, thanks a lot. Wonderful presentation and sharing of ideas with us. Thank you very much.
Setting me up so well.
Thank you.
Had a great presentation. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.